Welcome to Versus. I'm Colin Sandberg of the Endurance Collective, and I'm here, as always, with Ben Turretz, founder of the Endurance Collective. And today we also have a very special guest, Liz Raynor. Liz is a registered dietitian, an NSCA certified strength and conditioning specialist, an NASM Corrective Exercise Specialist. She earned her bachelor's degree in exercise and sport from UNC at Chapel Hill, her master's of science in nutrition at Meredith College, and she completed her dietetic internship through Meredith College as well. And Liz, you also just finished a 50-mile ultramarathon.
I did.
Correct?
Probably my best all the accomplishments you just mentioned, probably my favorite.
Yeah, that was.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, kudos. We're all impressed.
Thank you. There will be more. There will be more. So I'm excited about that.
I heard there's 100 on your in the windshield now.
There is. I would really like to do the Umstead 100 next year if I can get into it. It's not super competitive to get in, but there's kind of a little bit of a high demand, low spot. So if I can get in, yeah, I'd love to do the 100 next year.
This podcast will surely put you at the front of the line.
Yeah.
Here's to hoping.
So today we're going to be talking about strength training, specifically for cyclists, although I think that a lot of what we're talking about will transfer over to other endurance athletes, specifically runners. Just with a focus, we're going to be focusing mainly on cycling. And like many of the topics that we've talked about here, there's a lot of directions that we could go in. But and hopefully we can do some of that in future episodes. But I want to focus today specifically on just the basic sort of to lift or not to lift, because amazingly enough, this is still something that seems to be still controversial, and it's been controversial for more than 100 years.
I mean, Colin, how many local cycling listservs are there where this debate is like ongoing right now?
You're gonna get me in trouble.
I won't mention.
These are our friends.
Yeah.
But it's local, and there's still some pretty high profile coaches who really don't prescribe any strength training. I think it's safe to say all three of us are going to land on the pro strength training side, but I want to try to get
spoil
into
it, man.
I want to try to get into these issues, and picking apart maybe a little bit of playing devil's advocate, why some people feel this way still. But before we do that, I was really hoping, Liz, that we could just define some terms, because I think the terminology here does get very confusing.
Yeah.
So what is strength training?
So I'm going to disclaimer that these are like my interpretations of some of the definitions first off. But when I think of strength training, and when I want other people to think of strength training, I want us to think about like moving load with our body. So like loading our muscles and joints. That can be with weight. That could be when you're moving, like from house to house. Like there's so many different ways that strength training can look, but we're applying load to our tissues, putting them under strain. And that to me is what the basics of strength training are. So like when I guess to tease it out from like running or cycling, you're not moving load necessarily with your tissues when you do aerobic exercise versus strength. Like at the basic level, strength would be picking something up and putting it down, like something heavy.
Okay. How about core? What is core? Because I think a lot of people say, oh, I do core work, but yeah, that can be a confusing term too, right?
Totally. So I think my definition is probably different from a lot of people's. I like to think of the core one of two ways. One would be anything that's attached to the lumbopelvic hip complex. So that'd be like your pelvis and hip area, any musculature that's attached there. But to pare it down a little bit, because that's a lot, would be glutes. So all three glute muscles, all of the muscles of your abdominal region. So like, the typical six-pack muscles people think of, but also like lower core, kind of like pelvic floor type musculature, as well as like transverse abdominis, which is like kind of a corset muscle that runs around your torso. And then I also like to include lats in it as well. So when I think about core for endurance athletes, both runners and cyclists, I like to think of glutes, lats, and core. And for those two groups, I would have them focus on those three muscle groups in different proportions. So like cyclists, I would have focus more on lats than like runners typically.
Right.
Yeah, that's how I would define the core.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would not think of glutes or like doing deadlifts as core work.
Oh my goodness, but deadlifts should work where I could take you on so many tangents here.
Right.
Deadlifts arguably should work like abdominal muscles just as much as anything else you think a deadlift should work. And that is something I hope people take away from hearing about strength and even like working with me, is that every exercise is a core exercise when it's done properly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's a bunch of follow-up questions I'd love to ask there, but I don't want this podcast to last 3 hours. How about mobility? What's mobility?
Okay, so I wrote something down for this. Let me pull it up because I knew you were going to ask me about mobility versus flexibility. So flexibility is the ability of a muscle to lengthen passively through range of motion. So the ability of a muscle to lengthen passively versus mobility is the ability of a joint to move actively through a range of motion. So when we think about it, flexibility is passive, mobility is more active, and mobility is more joint focused. Flexibility is more focused on musculature. So when we think about applying that to exercises, flexibility could be, this is super basic, like a static stretch of the quad muscle, like the front of the thigh. So that one that you did as a kid, and maybe some people still do, where you pull your heel into your butt and you point straight down to the floor, you're stretching your quad. That's flexibility, like the ability to move your quad in that way. And then mobility would be like, squat depth or spinal rotation and things like that.
Okay. So is it more about like the ability to produce force at a greater range?
Are you talking about for mobility?
Yeah.
I would say mobility is like the ability of your muscles to allow your joints to move a certain way. So I would say it's less about like force or anything like that, and more about like for ankles, for example, let's take a squat. Like if you have poor ankle mobility, you probably are not going to have really great squat depth. And that's related to like musculature attached to your ankle joint and whether or not the muscles are flexible enough to allow that joint to be mobile. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you think that mobility or flexibility is more important for an endurance athlete? That is
mobility. Yeah. Okay. Because I think this is, again, some of this is my take just based on like my experience. So I've been a strength trainer for over 10 years. And in my experience, there is a certain amount of flexibility that's beneficial. Obviously, that contributes to joints being mobile in your sport of choice. But at a certain point, especially for runners and cyclists, there is a certain amount of muscle tone that is beneficial. And when I say tone, I almost mean like tightness that's beneficial to your sport. So if you think about like Ben is a massage therapist, like there's a certain, like if you worked on my hips and they were like the loosest they've ever been, my runs are probably going to feel terrible because my body needs a certain amount of like, I call it like inflexibility. I don't want people to take that and run with it. Tension. In order to produce the movements that we're going for.
Force generation, I think, is really, important. And, as a massage therapist, it's why we don't work deep prior to competition. That we work really hard to stay superficial if we're close to competition. But that mobility being such an important part of cycling. And so, like ankle mobility is something that maybe not a lot of people think about in cycling, but if you have inflexible ankles, you might be driving your knee higher in your pedal stroke and forcing it to overcorrect somewhere. So I agree with you. Not that matters.
I heard somebody talking about this once, and they were talking about what like the for lack of a better term, the old person shuffle. Like when you see 90-year-old woman power walking, but like it's kind of a shuffle because and maybe they're really flexible, but they've lost some of that tension in their muscles?
I see a lot of people actually day to day that are really flexible and don't have great mobility. So they don't always go together. And like, it really, I'd say, is like joint and muscle specific. So like you can have great mobility somewhere and great flexibility in one area and really poor mobility in another area. And again, it's going to be sport specific depending on like what you should focus on, which joints.
Okay. How about stability? What's stability?
So when we talk about stability within strength training and like prepping for cycling or running, what I like to think about is like the ability to withstand like disruption. So like to be stable in an exercise or in cycling, like the ability to withstand like hitting like a rock or a root, or like the ability to be stable under unstable conditions. That's how I think of like stability training. Obviously something that's stable is just sturdy, right? Like that's the like basic definition of being stable, is like a table where all the legs are even and it can't be rocked around or disrupted. But when I talk about stability, like if you want to talk about stability work in the like training, I would say the way you train that is by trying to be stable in unstable conditions. So like on one leg, on, a Bosu ball, stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that a lot of cyclists have major instabilities because the nature of the sport allows you to develop certain muscles a lot and barely use others. But then when you're in a situation like, say, sprinting or going around a technical mountain bike course or something, out of the saddle climbing, even, suddenly like that stability or lack of it can be a real problem.
Definitely. Yeah. I'd say for endurance athletes in general, and when I say that, I mean like cyclists, triathletes, runners specifically, typically a lack of stability is something that can lead to injury or poor performance, and it can be improved through sport-specific strength training.
Yeah. And I think of most cycling injuries as chronic injuries, but it is possible to have acute injuries. I've had athletes pull their groin sprinting, which, yeah. Okay, finally, hypertrophy.
Yeah, so hypertrophy, I'd say basic definition, building muscle mass, like muscles getting actual like muscle bodies, muscle fibers getting larger, which typically happens with some types of strength training. I know we're going to get into this a lot. Hypertrophy is not like a coincidence. It is intentional. You are not going to just coincidentally be like, oh, look, my biceps have gotten like an inch bigger in diameter. Like that just doesn't, it's not just something that like all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're like, wow, hypertrophy. Like it's very specific. The ability to build muscle mass through strength training is not just
I can make my pecs dance.
Like a happy side effect. It doesn't just like happen magically. Yeah.
But that's probably what most people think of strength training as, is that hypertrophy. And I guess one of the reasons I wanted to define all these things is all of these things can be part of strength training, right? Totally. The mobility, flexibility, stability, not just the hypertrophy part of it. That's sort of the glory part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody out there is listening to this that's worked with me before, you know that like 50% of a strength training session with me typically is like mobility, stability, flexibility work. And then the other 50% would be more sport specific strength work. I view improving mobility as like a precursor to building strength. Or a part of it alongside of it. So typically like things like foam rolling, dynamic warm-ups, and even some static stretching post activity, I'd say are all something that, I would like to go under the umbrella of strength training. I'm sure there's people out there that would disagree, but I feel like you can't do good heavy lifting without those components.
Right. And that seems to me why I guess I have changed my thinking on strength training a little bit, and I really think of it more now as something that you need to do year round, because it takes a while to develop all of those, that mobility and stability before you can even get to any hypertrophy.
And
if you're only lifting 6 months a year, it's probably taking you most of that time to just get what you need to even work up to that point.
I mean, think about like cycling, like training for an event or something. Like if you only train 6 months of the year and you literally don't touch a bike the other 6 months of the year, what's the first half of that 6 months of training going to look like?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, like that with strength training, just like with cycling, like you've got to build a base and then keep that base. You have to maintain it, even if you're not doing like the heaviest lifts all the time, which I would certainly say is not the goal either.
So the last term I wanted to ask you to define is functional strength, because I feel like that's a confusing term that a lot of people throw around, and I get confused by it too.
Yeah. So usually when people think of functional strength, they're thinking of like these complex multi-joint movements that are, you know, functional training is marketed as like helping you be better at life, right? Like it's functional, and that's correct. The definition of functional strength is that it can transfer over to like activities of daily living. So like it's functional. It allows you to do things in your day-to-day functionally better than you could otherwise. My argument about functional strength would be that all strength training, when done well, is functional strength training. Like if you're training properly, it should enhance your life. Like what is the point of doing strength training that is not benefiting your life in a functional way? Like if you're doing a whole bunch of lifting, but you can't like carry groceries to and from your car, or like if you're doing a bunch of strength training, but it's got you so messed up that you can't like sleep because your back hurts. Like if that to me is not functional. And I feel the same way about like running and cycling training as well. Like if you're cycling so hard that like it's taking away from your ability to live, I mean, unless it's paying all of your bills, what are we doing?
Yeah. I would argue, even if it is paying all your bills.
Yeah. Oh, I would too. But I mean, I understand pushing yourself to that point if it is your like full-time job, right? But yeah, that's what I think of as functional strength, is like something that enhances your life. It is functional. It can be like transferred to other parts of your life, that strength that you're building and that movement pattern.
How do you feel about training specificity with regards to your sport? So, you know, if I'm a cyclist, I'm doing a whole lot of hip flexion, hip extension, and, you know, not a whole lot of big thoracic rotation. So really training those very specifically. You know, I've had coaches when I was racing that did a lot of really cycling specific movements within strength training. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that versus just doing squats?
I think there's a place for it. Like, I think at a certain point in your strength training, there's certainly a place for like sports specific training. But I think with cycling, because it's such a repetitive movement, you're doing the same thing over and over again. When I think of the strength training that would be beneficial for a cyclist, I almost want it to be the opposite of what you're doing on the bike. Like I almost want it to be working the muscles that aren't working when you're on the bike. Because if you are just cycling, I'm thinking of like this, I know we probably will talk about this later, like quad dominance in cyclists is such a big thing, like inability to activate glutes, like posterior tilt of the pelvis, like if you're rounded over, or an anterior tilt of the pelvis, like cyclists, I've seen both. I want you to do the opposite in strength training at first. Like I want us to, instead of focusing on hip flexion, like you're flexing your hip enough, your quads are getting worked. Like what about your glutes? What about your hamstrings? What about your back? So I think there's a place for sports specific training. I typically don't recommend doing it right at first. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, but like there's a certain foundation we all have to build before we start incorporating strength training. And I would say that at that point, we're not ready for like sports specific. Like if you can't even do a squat, do I want you doing a squat on a Bosu ball holding a set of like bike like handles? No, like I want you to learn to do a squat first and then move into that. So that would be my take.
I think one of the unfortunate side effects of the social media age and everybody having Instagram is a lot of people, I think, instead of going to expert coaches for help, they're like looking on Instagram, and a lot of those people are, they need to get attention to get subscribers, and so they're doing really complicated
well, even like, you know, you see, and this is not a knock at Kate Courtney. I think she's fantastic and she does great strength work. But she, you know, she posted a lot of her cycling specific and instability, mobility work, and it's great stuff. You know, I think seeing, I had athletes, entry level athletes, trying to attempt some of these things, and you know, it was a challenge to them. And as a coach, they're asking me why we're not doing that.
Yeah.
You know, I'd like to echo what you just said, Liz, is hey, if you can't execute, you know, I want you to be able to do a squat with a kettlebell and you can feel your core and your glutes active at the same time. Until we can master that, you know, I don't want you juggling tennis balls while standing on an upside down.
Yeah. And so those exercises are great once you're there, right? Like once you've got that base, there's certainly a place for them. And I would say like during the season, that's even good stuff to start incorporating because it is lighter than like the strength work you'd probably do more in the off season. So yeah, there's a spot for it. It's just typically not when if you're like just getting started with strength training, I can say with confidence, we're not there yet. And that doesn't mean those aren't great exercises. We're just not there yet.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's, I guess, dive into the main question here. And like I said in the introduction, I feel like it's a little crazy that this debate has been going on so long and it's still a debate. I mean, I remember watching this this miniseries on Major Taylor. This takes place in 1900 and he's lifting weights. And people come into the gym and are like, dude, what are you doing? This is cycling. And of course, you know, that was 1900, but that debate is still going on. And I think we've made progress. I mean, Ben, you mentioned Kate Courtney, and there's been a bunch of public stuff from Peter Sagan, Nick Schurter. And I think that's good. That's positive.
But like you said, I also have worked with some really high level coaches who run, you know, businesses that, you know, coach thousands of athletes who completely neglect strength training. They don't believe it's important for, you know, to execute a good cycling program.
There are a lot of cyclists, including some really successful ones, who do precisely zero strength training.
Yeah.
So why do so many cyclists have this bias against strength training?
I think you all could probably answer that question better than me, honestly. In case I am not a cyclist. My husband is a cyclist, but I work with a lot of cyclists, but I have never personally been a cyclist. I feel like I do think the concerns for all endurance athletes are similar. And the ones I typically hear are like the weight. So like bulking up and stuff like that, which, do you want me to go ahead and address that one right now? Because it's one of my favorites.
Adding mass, I will tell you, you know, throughout my life, I was told from the time I was racing as a junior until, I mean, gosh, not that long ago, that adding mass was a problem. And, you know, we didn't want to, gosh, if you change your watts per key, you're going to become a worse cyclist. You know, I picture triplets of Belleville, and like, you know, that's the optimal body shape that a road racer or a XCO mountain bike racer should have. You know, for me, it wasn't until really since I started working with you that, you know, I've really started lifting heavy.
Yeah. And I think my argument against the mass piece of things is building mass in general, even if you're not an endurance athlete. So let's just like start with the basics. Building mass in general is not unintentional. Like if you are not trying to build muscle mass, for most people, and obviously there's exceptions to this, but when we're talking about cyclists, like most people who are training, like trained cyclists who are doing like regular, you know, I don't know, 8 to 10 hour weeks of cycling, like you're not just going to coincidentally build mass from lifting twice a week. When the biggest thing, in my opinion, I'm also a dietitian, like we talked about at the beginning, the biggest thing that helps us build mass is being in like a positive energy balance, which means you are taking in more food than your body needs. And so you are able to build additional tissue, whether that is fat mass, muscle mass, or typically, honestly, when people are trying to bulk, it's a little bit of both. You build muscle mass and you do have a little bit of fat mass. And then people will do, you know, like strength training, like bodybuilders and stuff will do like a cut, and then they'll kind of try to reduce fat mass while maintaining that muscle that they've put on. But my point in sharing that is like, we're not doing bodybuilder workouts, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We're doing like sports specific strength training. So I'm not saying go to the gym and do bicep curls. I can guarantee you if you do bicep curls and you're eating enough calories, you might get some biceps, you know, like that might happen. But when it comes to doing like sports specific strength training for cyclists, you are not going to put on mass unless you're trying to, or unless like your nutrition isn't dialed and you're eating like significantly more than you're burning. And I have yet to meet endurance, like a single probably endurance athlete that's able to maintain a positive energy balance during training. Like most endurance athletes have a really hard time eating even enough to keep them out of a negative energy balance, let alone matching their needs and then exceeding them consistently enough to build mass. Like, you know, that's one piece of it. And then my second thing that I always love to share with endurance athletes when talking about strength training is the amount of mass you might gain. Like, let's say you gain like 1 or 2 pounds, right? Like 2.2 pounds is a kilogram. So let's say you even gain like a kilogram if you're out there and you are listening and you like to measure in kilograms. I can almost guarantee, and the research supports this, that the performance benefits you're going to get from that muscle mass and doing strength training are going to outweigh any negative consequences of gaining 2 pounds. Like, you know, we're talking about like, I don't know, if you weigh 150 pounds, like math, not my strong suit on Friday morning. I mean, that's a very low percentage of your body weight that you're putting on.
Yeah, if I put on 2 pounds of glute mass, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, initially I was thinking, well, that's extra mass I have to tow up a hill, but it seems to me that's extra pounds that are going to go towards producing more force in my pedal.
Yeah. And so I'm not saying like, obviously if you put on like 25 pounds, like that might make a difference in your performance. But if we talk about additional mass specifically resulting from strength training, one, I don't think it's going to happen for most people. And two, if it is a couple pounds, the research supports that those couple pounds are going to make a bigger difference in your performance in a positive way than a negative. Another place, my husband's also a dietitian, that we talk about this a lot, is people being unwilling to carry adequate fuel and hydration with them on the bike because they're scared it's going to weigh them down, like the extra bottles. And I would say the same, I know this is a different podcast for a different time, but the same thing goes for that. Like that additional weight being on your bike and the performance gains you'll get from being adequately fueled and hydrated are certainly going to outweigh any negative benefits of having extra weight on your bike. Yeah. So
I think in general, it's safe to say that cyclists overestimate how much of a downside extra weight is. And I mean, I think if you run the numbers, it's really, really minimal how much extra gravitational force you're going to have, even from 5 or 10 pounds.
Yeah.
And even, you know, when I've seen people who like lose 20 pounds, the biggest change is they can get more aerodynamic.
Yeah.
It's not that they feel like they climb so much better, because, you know,
they probably
climbing
don't
ends up being,
if they lose weight.
Yeah. And I mean, if you can, if you lose weight, but you also lose your ability to produce power, it's like very quickly not worth it.
Yeah.
But weight is something that's easy for people to quantify. You walk into a bike shop, you pick up a bike, it's the first thing you look at. It's a lot harder to quantify aerodynamics and rolling resistance and stuff.
Well, and rate of force production, and we always, Colin, you and I hear watts per kilo from our athletes all the time.
Yeah.
And how many climbs are racers doing that are over 25, 30, 40 minutes, where watts per key really comes into impact their performance, where it's like, man, I need you to produce watts.
Yeah.
I mean, watts per kilo has a purpose, I think, because if we're talking about a 100-pound woman versus a 200-pound man, like, you can't just say, oh, well, my threshold is 300 watts, oh, mine's 185. You're not really talking about apples to apples. But if two people, if one person says my watts per kg is 4.5 and the other person says no, I'm 4.6, that really tells me that is not a good predictor of performance.
No.
Okay, so I think one of the other arguments that a lot of people have against strength training is this idea that you're going to be too tired to perform your, quote, more important cycling workouts. Is that true?
My answer would be no. But again, I want to take it back to like the beginning here. And I want us to think about like a training cycle with no strength training at all and how those cycling workouts would typically go. And I know plenty of people probably have amazing training cycles, like runners and cyclists alike. But what are some of the like overtraining issues that y'all typically experience when you can you imagine or go back to a training cycle where you didn't do strength training? What happened?
Low back pain, and or lateral knee pain. I could definitely feel more fatigue on my hands because, I'm leaning more on putting my hands on the bars more. Less pelvic stability.
Yeah. So there's all these.
I get more saddle sores. Sorry to interrupt you. I get more saddle sores too, though. And I think, a lot of that is like when there's less stability, I'm moving around in the saddle a lot more. And if I'm trying to do a lot of volume, I mean, that can be debilitating.
Yeah. So let's talk about like benefits of strength training, because I think that's going to help answer this question of like the pros and cons of like this potential fatigue from strength training, which personally I've never experienced. Obviously, I'm not a cyclist, but I've also never experienced it as a runner incorporating strength training regularly, that like the fatigue from my strength workouts when positioned properly took away from my running workouts. If anything, it enhanced it. And here's some of the reasons why. So like one of the benefits of incorporating strength training consistently for cyclists is going to be improved strength of tendons, ligaments, and muscles. So like your tendons and ligaments, which could potentially get irritated, like I think about like Achilles, like tendonitis, and what are some other itises of the tendons that you all see in cyclists sometimes? Do you see any?
I would say patellar tendonitis.
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
It's a big one.
Yeah.
We get, as a massage therapist, we see a ton of really short hip flexors.
Yeah.
Because of inactive glutes.
Yep.
I would say hamstring tendonitis is a big one. It's really anything that's involved in leg flexion or extension.
Yeah. So strengthening those tissues would be beneficial, right? And strength training does that. Like there's research to support that for cyclists and runners that like tendon strength is improved through strength training. And when you think about it on the bike, like you're not loading those muscles in the same way you are when strength training. So cyclists, this is a difference between cyclists and runners. Actually, runners, their legs are actually under a lot of load from the impact. And there's a lot of like eccentric load as well, which is when your muscles are put under stress when they're like, they're eccentric. So they're coming I'm doing a hand motion for a podcast. Your muscles are lengthening. That is like an eccentric contraction when they're under load, versus concentric is what we normally think of, which is when your muscles are shortening under load. So that's like flexion, like your bicep is concentrically contracting when you do a bicep curl. But cyclists, I think, can benefit from this even more than runners, putting their tissues under load in order to strengthen them. So that's one. Sorry,
cycling is I was going to say cycling is primarily a concentric sport, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, almost really exclusively.
Yeah. There's very little, unless you do some sort of specific eccentric work on the bike. It's exclusively.
And eccentric strength training typically causes more damage in the muscle and can lead to like greater adaptations and things like that. And I wouldn't necessarily say that cyclists all need to go out and do eccentric training. I actually don't think they do. But loading the tissues in that way is something that cyclists get even less of than runners because of the like low impact nature of the sport. And so those tendons and muscles aren't used to like the load in the impact and the load in the same way. So that's one benefit of strength training that you get. And when you think about the way that patellar tendonitis or Achilles issues would impact your training, imagine if those things went away, and imagine if it was because you did strength training. So that's
I was going to say, well, if the NFL draft is this week, and if I get drafted as a running back, for maybe the Patriots,
that's the likely scenario.
Right. Am I more susceptible to ACL, MCL, LCL tears because I've only been doing concentric work all my life?
Yeah, I would say yes. Like if you are a cyclist and somehow you're magically drafted, you would have done yourself a disservice that you had not been doing strength training. Because I can tell you those guys doing that are in the draft, they're strength training. And again, it's a similar reason, because it helps reduce the risk of injury. So that would be one benefit of strength training. Another one is going to be what you all have kind of already talked about. And I'm looking at some of my notes here to make sure I say this properly, but like rate of force development for endurance athletes is probably one of the biggest reasons to strength train as well. So your ability to produce force and do so quickly is improved by heavy strength training. So neuromuscular alterations can happen when we strength train, and they include improving rate of force production, motor unit synchronization. So think about, I really like to simplify things, all your motor units in your muscles moving together, like all the rowers on a boat rowing in the same direction at the same time, is a lot more powerful than if like 60% of the rowers are rowing and the rest are kicking their feet back, drinking a beer. Like it's not going to work. Frequency modulation and autogenic inhibition, as well as reduced antagonist inhibition, are all strength training benefits for cyclists. So all of that is to say your muscles are going to work more efficiently if you strength train in cycling, and your ability to produce force will be better. So where this is typically seen in cycling is the hard efforts, and especially the hard efforts when you're tired. So you're not going to go out for like an easy 3-hour ride and all of a sudden feel like strength training has made the biggest difference and you notice a huge like improvement. You're going to see the benefits of strength training in those workouts where you're worried about being too tired from strength training, if that makes sense. So like your ability to perform in those workouts would be, with consistent, proper sports specific strength training, would be improved more than they would be hurt by strength training. So like that's going to be another benefit. And then let's talk about more. It can't improve your VO2 max. So I know a lot of like cycling specific workouts, people are probably wanting to like improve their VO2 max and other metrics.
VO2 max by definition is an aerobic measure.
Yep.
So anaerobic training, which is what strength training is not going to improve an aerobic measure. And I know that's another reason that endurance athletes are typically like, well, why would I do strength training? Because like this is an aerobic sport and I'm improving these anaerobic functions. But there are times during a race or during a workout where you are relying on anaerobic systems. And I'm going to share more about the benefits here in a minute, but like up a hill, especially up a hill when you're tired, the end of a race, when passing someone, all of those are times when you push just a little harder and you're dipping into like anaerobic conditions instead of aerobic. And if you've never trained that, like outside of just the rides you're doing, and your muscles aren't strong enough, like somebody who's been strength training is probably going to beat you. And so at VO2 max, strength training can improve velocity and power output in endurance athletes. So Specifically, your power output at your VO2 max is going to be higher if you strength train. And a disclaimer, all these benefits I'm talking about are at heavy loads, so greater than 80% of your 1 rep max. So I'm not talking about like body weight squats here. And there's a place for those in the beginning, but I'm talking about the benefits from strength training are from heavy lifting. It's not from body weight movement. So to tie all of that back, I could talk about this for like 6 hours, but to tie all of it back to the fatigue piece, I'm hoping that just sharing a few of those benefits can help you see that maybe if your legs feel a little tired after a strength training workout and you go to do like a more intense ride, that in the long run, you're still getting the benefits of that workout, even if your legs are a little bit tired. And some ways to mitigate that, I would say, would be if I'm working with an athlete that's a runner or a cyclist, I'm always going to have them do their strength work on a hard workout day. I'm never going to have them do it on a rest day or an easy ride day, because your rest days and your easy ride days, if you're lifting at greater than 80% of your 1 rep max, it's not an easy ride day anymore. That's a hard day. So I would have people lift on their hard workout days, and I would have them do the lift after, honestly. Like I would have you ride in the morning, and then I wouldn't have you just go right into strength, because you're not gonna be able to lift at 80% of your 1 rep max after a hard workout. I would have you work like your 8-hour workday, whatever you got, come home, eat a snack, lift. And then the next day is probably going to be an easy ride day because you had a hard workout that day. You'll recover. And by the next time you have a hard cycling workout 2 or 3 days later, if we've recovered properly, my hope would be you wouldn't notice the fatigue, which leads me to my final point on this ramble, which is that if we are feeling extremely tired and have a lot of muscle soreness post heavy lift that's impacting our ride 2 or 3 days later, that is not an overtraining issue. That's an under recovery issue. So I'm a big proponent of under recovery, like instead of calling something overtraining, because our bodies can do a lot more than we think they can. But if we don't help them recover properly, you're right, they won't be able to do it. So I don't really subscribe to the idea that adding strength training would put you at risk of overtraining if you're willing to make the sacrifices to recover properly after the strength training.
I think part of the issue on the other side is also there's a lot of cyclists. This is one of my pet peeves, and I think it's true with you too, Ben, that a lot of cyclists doing too many days of intensity.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
If you're doing 4 or 5 days of high intensity work per week on the bike,
I would argue
of course,
it's not intense anymore. If you're doing 4 to 5 days, you're not getting to the intensity.
No.
But especially if you're trying to then say, okay, how do I fit 1 or 2 days of lifting into or 3 days of lifting into this? That's a tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to solve that, but if you're doing 2 days of intensity per week, I think it's a lot, which tends to be what I average out. My prescriptions for athletes. It's a lot easier to fit that in.
Yeah.
So that's really all you can do. And I echo Colin and I would say even further, most of our athletes, certainly when we get our hands on them for the first time, I very often find that people aren't recovering during their recovery.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing a recovery ride at, 60% of their functional threshold or 70% of their functional threshold. And they're thinking, well, if I can talk, it's a recovery ride.
Yeah.
It's still an aerobic effort, but it is not, your body is not recovering. And, with that recovery ride that's when your body's it's repairing itself. It's making the adaptation. But if you're not recovering, you're not adapting.
Yeah.
So I just want to back up for 1 second, because Liz, you said, and I think this was a great sort of rhetorical question, like what happens if you don't lift?
Yeah.
And what are the things what are the dangers to that? And one thing you didn't mention that, if you run down the list of things that are going to keep people from riding, is crashing and a bad crash. And I am always amazed sometimes, and you see this like on TV sometimes in a pro race, somebody goes down in a crash that looks, I know you can't tell everything from the videos, but you see this crash and it's like, it doesn't look that bad. But you hear that they like broke their femur or broke their hip or something. And it's like, how the heck could that happen with that small, low speed crash? I think one of the big issues there is bone density. There was a study that came out, I think this is in the 90s, of pro cyclists, and found that a lot of these guys, even in their 20s, had dangerously low bone density, and therefore are going to be at much higher risk of, long-term things like osteoporosis, right? But also going down in a minor crash, which unfortunately is part of the sport, and being then off the bike for a few months potentially. So how does strength training play into that?
So a couple ways. I would say one, when we talk specifically about bone density in healthy individuals, and I'm saying that because if you have osteoporosis, osteopenia, definitely need to work with like doctors, PTs, and a professional who's like familiar with those conditions with your strength training. But if you are a healthy individual who does not have any of those conditions, strength training can improve bone mineral density. So the mechanism for that, and again, I'm a big fan of like simplifying things a little bit. So the way I'll describe it is like your muscles tugging on your bones basically makes them stronger. So bones, similar to muscles, when you work out, like muscles get these little micro tears in them and then heal back stronger. Again, I know I'm oversimplifying. So if you're like a exercise physiologist out there, bear with me, we're simplifying. But with bone mineral density, it's the same thing. like it's similar. The way I like to describe it is that we're strengthening your bones by putting load on them and increasing the load that they can handle. And a way to think about that is like if you're squatting 300 pounds in the gym and then your femur gets under, 50 pounds of force on the bike, it's done worse. Like it's held more, right? And that's the same for your muscles. Like they're going to be more resilient because they've done more. Like you've trained them to be stronger in that way. And yeah, the improvements in bone mineral density, I'd say, outside of for endurance athletes, it's a benefit of strength training for everyone. Like a lot of, I really like to talk about it with like postmenopausal women too. That's a population that really benefits from the bone mineral density improvements from strength training specifically. So anyone, it improves bone mineral density for all the athletes, all the non-athletes to do strength training. So that I see could certainly help with crashing. The other thing, the dietitian in me though, hears that story about a crash and I'm like, ooh, have we been eating enough here? Like what's going on there? Because oftentimes when somebody gets an injury like that, there can be like underlying issues with like absorption and or like like calcium and vitamin D levels, to name just a couple of things that could impact it. And so that's another thing to think about as an endurance athlete is like the strength training doesn't mean anything if we're not fueling it properly. Same with the cycling training. But yeah, that's how I could see it in a crash. And then the other thing I want to mention about the crash piece of things would be, I don't know research on this, but I'm imagining, and Ben, I know you've shared some of this with me anecdotally from your experience, I would imagine you're less likely to crash if you're strong enough when you get in a tough situation to get your way out of it. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Like as I've gone back to mountain bike racing, and disclaimer, I've been lifting with Liz, and heavy lifting. I've definitely been in some situations in rocky terrain where I think 5 years ago I wouldn't have been able to wrestle the front of my bike out of a rut, and now I'm less susceptible to crashing because I'm able to do that. And I'd even go further into when I do go down, things hold together better. I'm not hitting my clavicle, bony little clavicle on the ground. There's actually some muscle around my shoulder joint that's protecting that.
And the way you absorb that load when you go down is going to be differently. Like that's, again, athletes and non-athletes alike. It's why like older adults should strength train as well, is when you go down in a fall, if you're strong enough to catch yourself in like an appropriate way, you're less likely to get injured than if when you fall, your body like has no strength to like try to absorb the impact. And if your bones are absorbing the impact, they're probably going to break, you know?
Yep. Yep. You're just landing straight on top of it. It's just straight blunt force.
Yeah.
I just want to push back a little bit on part of what you said there, though, because as somebody who's primarily a road cyclist, I can't think of on the road a single crash I've had that I thought was really preventable.
Oh,
but
totally.
It's
if you're
part of the sport, if the guy in front of you crashes, you're going to go down no matter what. But as to the part of it that you said, you know, what happens, you know, do you lose a little skin or do you break your femur? Those are two very different outcomes.
And the way you catch yourself.
And I think cycling seems particularly bad, you know, compared to the other big non-weight bearing sports or what swimming and rowing, but those events tend to be a lot shorter. You know, you can hop, and I heard a statistic once, maybe Liz, you can verify this, but that cyclists can lose up to 200 milligrams of calcium per hour of sweat. So if you're not only not doing any weight bearing exercise, not taking a calcium supplement or eating properly and doing, you know, 20 to 30 hour training weeks regularly, I think it's understandable that you could have some pretty dangerously low bone density.
Yeah, definitely. And I have not heard that specific statistic, so I'm not able to verify it, but calcium is an electrolyte as well. Like it's included in electrolyte solutions and things like that. It does need to be replenished. And so, again, another podcast for another time, the downsides to not adequately replacing the electrolytes you're losing during your sport. My husband is a sports dietitian as well, and that's kind of his area of expertise. I mean, again, we talk about it for hours. Like there's so many downsides. And we did talk
with him a little bit on the podcast. We did with him, although I know there's room to talk about a lot of this stuff more.
Yeah.
So we talked about, Liz, you mentioned how strength training does not directly improve VO2 max. I wanted to get back a little bit to this issue because I think this is, for me, the third big reason why a lot of cyclists are resistant to strength training is that they just think, you know, the way you get better as a cyclist is by cycling. It's like the way you get to Carnegie Hall is practice. And I think even though there probably are direct benefits to cycling performance, although that itself can be difficult to define, I think it's the wrong question to ask. And I almost look at it like, you know, does having good tires on your car make your car faster? Well, maybe not directly, but if your tires are bald and your car's out of alignment, it doesn't matter how big your engine is, the car's not going to run very well or run very well without breaking down.
Yeah. I would say there is a bit more of a direct correlation with strength training to cycling than like I'm a car girl over here than wheels on the car. Like I would say there's more of a link than that. So that's an exciting thing for cyclists to know. Again, like the force transmission and the rate of force production and the power output piece, like in my eyes, that is directly transferable to your next race or your next hard workout. And another way I'd want to put it is like, let's say you are able to put out more power output at your VO2 max or produce more force, you're going to get more out of every single workout that you do. You are going to be producing more power and getting more out of that training session than you ever did before. And you're going to be able to go like, the other thing that gets improved is like running and cycling economy gets improved when you strength train. So like your ability to maintain a given speed and the corresponding effort, the effort goes down for that speed the more you strength train. So like your body's able to maintain a certain speed, like muscularly better than it would have previously. And so again, I like to, when I'm talking about strength training for cyclists and runners, for us to think about like, we're allowing you to get more out of every single workout you do from now on if you do strength training. And like, can you imagine your potential if you got a little bit more out of every single workout that you do because of these benefits? Like if you're producing more force or more power when you're doing like these maximal efforts or sprints or a lactate threshold ride or whatever it might be, you're going to get fitter aerobically because you're able to push harder, longer. And again, so when I think about strength training for cyclists, the benefits are not at the start of the ride, they're at the end of the ride, the end of the race, up the hills, in the hard workouts. And when you think about how many times as a cyclist you're in those situations and how much more you could get out of them, I don't see how you could not view strength training as a really important part of your training. And, I think, I'm sure we'll wrap up with this, but I'm not saying you need to strength train every single day. Like it really doesn't take much. And I'll talk about like generally the recommendations that like have been evidence-based from the research for strength training, but it's not like during a high volume part of your season, you might be maintaining your strength benefits you got in lower volume periods or the off season with one workout a week. And then like 4 to 6 weeks before your like big race, if you just have one, or like a couple weeks before each race, you might just do mobility and activation work and absolutely no strength training. And you're still, again, I'll talk more about the specifics of that in a bit when we wrap up, but you can maintain the benefits of strength training using just one session per week for up to 14 weeks. So if you strength train for like 3 months, 2 times a week, real heavy, like we've been talking about, and then you get into this high volume period of your season and you just go down to once a week, 14 weeks like that.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention just about because I love my car metaphors.
Yeah.
Is I recently had to replace the tires on my car. And what I noticed was driving around the neighborhood at 35 miles an hour, you don't even notice it. Then you get on the highway and you hit, 70 miles an hour and suddenly the whole thing starts shaking. Yeah. And I think in a way it can be the same with strength training in cyclists, because we don't notice there's a problem until like training's going well. And then suddenly, hey, we just bumped your FTP up by 30 watts. And it's like, great, I'm so excited about this. And then somebody gets injured. Or we bumped up your volume, or your sprint power is higher. Suddenly, like there's an injury. And I feel like it's extra tragic sometimes because they've worked so hard and they made progress. And then like, boom, you got a problem that then they need to spend the next few months or year focusing on to just get back to where they were. Yeah.
Yeah. And in my mind, still I love that car metaphor. And I feel like you hit the nail on the head with that one. Like, yes, you might not notice the benefits of strength training on an easy ride through the neighborhood, like just cruising. But when you get up to those higher intensities, that's where the benefits are. That's where you're really going to see the difference. And if you care about performance, isn't that when you'd want to see the differences, So yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. So yeah, I know we're already running a little bit late here, but could you give me maybe just 1 or 2 examples of common issues that cyclists have that maybe could be corrected or at least treated with strength training?
Yeah, so I would say, things I see cyclists come in with most commonly when I'm working with them are going to be, one, just a general like lack of awareness about how to engage certain muscles that should be engaged. So like, if I say like, do you know how to, what'd you say?
Glutes.
Yeah, like glutes. Like I will honestly like have strength training sessions with someone where I'm like, do you know how to engage your core? Like, what would that feel like to you to engage your core properly? And we don't know. Like, and that's not just cycling specific, but I do see it a lot with cyclists. Glute engagement is another huge one, and lat engagement. So talking about this core that we talked about in the beginning, just a lack of awareness about how to get those muscles to work and honestly when they should be working. And so like that's one of the things I spend a lot of time on with cyclists is like proper form in lifting. Because if we want to work our glutes, but you're doing the glute exercise and you don't know even what that should feel like, that's everything I've said so far, like everything we've said, like scratch it. Because if you're not getting if we're trying to work the glutes and your quads and hip flexors are doing it instead, I mean, we're not getting the benefit. So I would say that, but then I also see like a lot of like quad dominance and like hip flexor tightness and stuff like that I'm a trainer. I'm not a physical therapist or anything like that. So I can't be like diagnosing people with these issues or anything, but I'll see that like when I ask someone where they're feeling an exercise, like a squat, they'll feel it in their knees will hurt, or they'll feel it in their quads, or when they do a glute bridge, they'll feel their quads stretching so much that they can't even think about their glutes. And so there's this like tightness that also needs to be addressed as well. And it's kind of a vicious cycle. So like what we want to do on the bike is have people having core, glutes, lats engaged, posterior chain engaged, taking some pressure off of those hip flexion, those muscles that drive hip flexion, and creating just like a more balanced system. So that'd be what I see most often.
I really notice as a bike fitter too, that a lot of times the inability to put somebody in, I don't want to say the perfect, but there's no such thing as a perfect position, but the position I want to see them in. I'd like to get them a little bit more aggressive, but they can't do it because of a lot of those issues. And, you know, Ben, I'm sure you could talk about what you see. And
I mean, it's exactly to mirror what both of you are all saying. You know, when we focus a lot on assessment, and very often when we go through and we do you know, testing glute engagement, glute med specifically, I can just pin somebody to the table, and you know, their chief complaint is low back pain, knee pain. And it's very much lumbopelvic hip driven. And, you know, I think cycling and running are two sports where we just kind of do them. Nobody ever taught us how to do them.
Yeah.
So you just learn how to ride a bike, and that's how you ride a bike. Or, you know, you join cross country in middle school, and, you know, that's when you started running. But nobody took you through the proper way to generate force, how to pedal, how to stride. And so, yeah, that's, you know, that lumbopelvic hip stuff is you know, it's a killer. But if you get it nailed and, you know, and you can execute the proper lifts and the proper strength training, gosh, it's such a, you know, pardon the pun, like leg up on everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay. So, without going into too much detail, I guess, let's close with this. What are your general guidelines for cyclists, Liz? Can you give us a few just 30,000 foot recommendations?
Yeah. So we're talking about heavy lifting, right? The takeaway from this is that these lifts that provide the benefits we've discussed today are heavy. So I'm going to share with you what I would typically do with someone. And if this sounds like gibberish to you, I can't stress enough how important it is to work with a professional. I'm here. I'm available. Definitely can come work with me, but any professional, like I'm a CSCS, so I'm partial to like an athletic trainer, CSCS, somebody who has like sports specific experience versus like a more general trainer. And there's phenomenal trainers out there, but just the sports specific aspect, I can't stress enough, because you don't need to do bicep curls. Like that's not getting you where you want to go. But I would say finding a professional if you don't have an idea of what you're doing. Ben, working those biceps for faster cycling for sure. But I recommend, typically what I start with is like a 6-week prep phase with somebody. So I don't want you to go to like greater than 75% of your 1 rep max tomorrow if you don't even know what a one rep max is or how to engage your glutes. I want you to do about 6 weeks of prep work. So that looks different for every single person before getting into this higher intensity strength training. That a good time to start this is in an off season, but I start it with people in the middle of their season all the time. We just modify around races and things like that. And then I would have people getting to about 2-ish days a week during like the bulk of your season when you're not racing. And again, I'd want those to fall on like hard workout days, not easy days or rest days. And then during those, you'd be lifting loads ideally greater than 75% of your 1 rep max. And you'd want it to be about like 4 to 10 reps, depending on the person. Usually like the research that I've seen is like, ideally we get to a point where we're lifting about 6 to 8 reps for about 3 sets, and resting about 2 to 3 minutes in between. And then depending on so this is not as much for cyclists, but for runners, eventually at that point, I'd want them to add some plyometric, like high intensity impact exercises as well. And yeah, I'd have people do that twice a week, activation, foam rolling in there as well. But I can't stress enough, like I know that probably sounded like very not accessible. Literally anything is better than nothing. So like if you have never done glute work before, getting in like some activation, like, you know, cycling magazines or running magazines always put out these circuits, and the exercises do have some merit to them. So even just getting in that kind of stuff, it's going to give you some of those benefits of like the injury prevention piece of things if you're doing them properly. So that'd be how I would work with someone. Again, I'd recommend working with a professional to get things going. The workout that you do or the workouts you do don't need to be different every single week. Like I really like my athletes to find something that works for them and their body and adjust weight, but hit the same thing kind of over and over throughout their training cycle, just with some tweaks here and there. But that'd be where I'd recommend starting twice a week, working up over the course of a couple months to like the 3 sets of like 8-ish reps on those heavier exercises. You don't have to do a 1 rep max test to get there. The last 3 reps should feel really hard, but you can do them with good form. The amount of times that corresponds to about 75% of your 1 rep max is astounding. So you don't need to do a 1 rep max test unless you want to with support. I would say that's probably more detailed than a 30,000 foot view, but
well,
that's what I got.
Do you think people need to get a gym membership? Or because I think this is especially, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of people still don't feel totally safe going to a gym, you know, mask wearing, depending on where you live, you know, maybe is not great. It's understandable, of course, if people are breathing hard. I have a lot of people who still don't feel safe going to a gym. Can you do this pretty well at home with minimal equipment?
Yes, I'd say absolutely. I mean, like the heavy, more compound lifts, obviously with a barbell, like, or really heavy kettlebells and things like that, you might not have those accessible at your house. I have a lot of athletes that use like around the house things. Like I had a client the other day who uses like a cylinder, like cement block for like squats. And obviously as we get heavier, that's going to need to change, but it's working fine. So I'd say if it's
curls.
Yeah, if it's safe for you to hold it and you're not going to like drop it, you certainly can use objects from around the house. But also, I think it's a worthwhile investment if you plan to cycle for like decades to come. You know, get a couple things to have at home, some bands, like some weights that feel good for you to start with. You know, the adjustable dumbbells, honestly, for the pandemic, I think have been one of the coolest things because you can hold a dumbbell like a kettlebell, you can make it heavier. And then you're able to do lighter and heavier options. So I typically don't use dumbbells very much with my clients, but for home workouts, if they have adjustable dumbbells, that's a cost-effective way to have a variety of weights on hand. But yeah, you don't need to have a gym membership. And again, because that first couple months you'd be doing activation type of exercises anyways, and mobility work, like you don't need a gym membership to do those kinds of things. And then the last thing I'll stress is that when I talked about those heavier lifts and things like that, certainly not in the heat of competition. Like I can't stress enough that like strength training is going to make you tired the week before a race. So you shouldn't be lifting 75% of your 1 rep max, even probably 2 weeks before a race, maybe even 3, depending on your taper and things like that. And I also don't recommend strength training during down weeks. So if you have a week with like no workouts, that's a down week.
Yeah.
Activation, mobility, foam rolling, recovery, it's a down week.
Interesting.
Yes.
Well, that's great. I think a lot of people will find that very, very helpful. So we always end these podcasts with a little bit of a bonus question. We got something that is strength training this week that I've wondered about. What kind of noises should I make when I lift weights? Should I be grunting, squealing, yelling, whistling? What's appropriate? I know this is a big deal, especially like Planet Fitness.
Teapot.
I've really heard it all. I mean, to be honest, I know these things make us laugh, but like, whatever gets the job done. Like, if you need to grunt, if you need to whistle, rock on with yourself. Like, as long as you don't mind the stares from quieter lifters, there's no right or wrong. I would say breathing would be the ideal perfect noise to make when you lift. Like, don't hold your breath. So the whistling does make me a little bit nervous, restricting some airflow. So maybe don't take that away from this podcast. But yeah, whatever you got to do to get the job done, as long as you're breathing. I
just don't want to get kicked out of Planet Fitness again.
Have you been kicked out of Planet Fitness?
No.
Interesting. Well, if you have a garage gym or you come work out with us at EC, we do not kick people out for making noises. There is actually some. Sorry, go ahead.
The dentists come downstairs and ask us if we're having a rave. Is what happens.
Yeah, because we do crank the tunes. We do crank the tunes. Oh, okay. So if you need to grunt, I'll crank the tunes extra loud, and you can rock on with whatever noises you need to make to move the heavy loads. Okay, that's an awesome question.
Well, as long as the dentists don't think we're filming a porno.
I like to think that our music choices are typically not the kinds that would be put in a porno, but I would not consider myself an expert on that type of music. So who knows?
All right. Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much, Liz. This was really good. I know we went a little longer than planned, but this was really helpful. And there's a lot of other stuff we could get into here. Totally. Just to wrap this up, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Instagram DMs, it's Liz Raynor, RAYNOR_RD. You can always DM me, or my email, I train through the Endurance Collective, is liz@theendurancecollective.com. So I'd love to hear from you if you want to work with me or you just have questions. But yeah, I hope this was helpful.
Great. Thanks so much.